Hey everyone, tonight we are going to embark on an icy odyssey of endurance, fear, and hope. A tale of a lone survivor caught beneath an avalanche's frozen grip. So before we get started, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so I can keep making better videos. Now enjoy a cup of hot tea and let's embark on this journey together tonight. They set out before dawn, the mountain's spine etched sharply against an ink-black sky. Frost crunched beneath crampons as the four climbers, three seasoned guides, and the lone mountaineer Elias moved in deliberate rhythm up the glacier's sloping face. Each breath yielded a thin veil of vapor, dissipating into the still morning air. Though the world remained silent, the tension was palpable. Dark clouds roiled on the horizon, and the wind whispered warnings through the ice-carved crevasses. Elias adjusted the straps on his pack, the metal frame resting heavily against his back. He could taste the cold on his tongue, harsh and metallic, as he drew in another lungful of air. Around him, his team exchanged clipped nods. They knew the mountain's temperament, unforgiving yet alluring, and respected it with every cautious step. A single misjudgment here could cascade into disaster. They paused at a narrowing between two seracs. Jagged towers of ice loomed overhead, their edges angular and severe. The guide in front tapped the surface lightly with an ice axe. The ring of sound resonated strangely in the vast, silent expanse. No cracking followed, and they pressed onward, each careful footfall a pact between man and ice. Up ahead, Elias spied a subtle line etched across the slope, a faint ridge that marked the transition from old snow to fresh drifts. His heart quickened. In arenas like this, appearances could betray a hidden weakness. What seemed solid might conceal a cavernous void. He reminded himself to keep breathing evenly, to stay present. In the coldest of environments, awareness could mean the difference between life and oblivion. The team reached a plateau where the glacier stretched out like a pale, monolithic field. The air grew thinner each step, more laborious than the last. Elias's legs burned a dull ache that pulsed with each push upward. He wiped sweat from his brow even as icy mist settled on his hair. Overhead, the sullen clouds had thickened, casting a diffuse gray light upon the barren slope. Suddenly, a flurry of snow erupted from the ridge, above a silent surge at first, like a slow-motion waterfall of powder. The guide's stiffened eyes locking on that shifting mass. A moment later, a thunderous roar split the air. The avalanche unleashed itself down the mountainside in a thunderous cascade of ice and snow. The ground trembled beneath Elijah's feet, and in an instant, gravity's pull turned ally to adversary. Elias barely processed the shriek of rushing ice before the ground gave way. His legs vanished beneath him as the avalanche's force fractured the surface. He tumbled headlong into a churning wall of cold despair. The world went white, then black as snow slammed across his face and buried his senses in a paralyzing shock. He hit the ice with a gut-wrenching impact, skidding across a slick expanse before coming to a trembling stop. Silence swallowed him, punctuated only by his own ragged gasps muffled by a layer of compacted snow. Panic fluttered like a trapped bird in his chest, but he forced himself to lie still, to listen. Through the cold that numbed his limbs, he realized he had slid into a hidden crevasse, an ice cavern concealed by the fresh snow. The roof of the cavern pressed close overhead, its underside glinting like frosted glass. A dim gray light filtered in from cracks above, painting the walls with ghostly patterns. Elias lay sprawled on his back boots, dangling toward an unknown abyss. Cold seeped into his bones, an insidious infiltrator that crept along nerve endings and absorbed warmth. He flexed his fingers, feeling each joint protest. Drawing breath was an effort. The air was stale recycled within this frozen sarcophagus. Yet he remained conscious, shock never fully dulling his mind. In that moment, clarity emerged out of fear. Help was distant, time was finite, and his only choices were to endure silent darkness or succumb to it. He willed his heart to steady, guiding his breath into measured inhalations. The weight of the avalanche above threatened to collapse the fragile ceiling. Small cracks spidered outwards, tiny fragments of ice tinkling down like bones. Elias assessed his pack's position, 1 foot tangled in a strap, the frame jammed against a protruding slab of ice. If he moved too abruptly, he risked dislodging more debris, summoning every reserve of strength. He shifted his body a fraction, testing which movement caused the least disturbance. A hiss of air escaped when his elbow scraped against the wall of the crevasse. Instinct snapped him back. Any sound might trigger further collapse. Instead, he focused on gathering warmth, where he could, pressing a gloved hand to his chest, sending fleeting pulses of heat through his torso. Outside, the storm gathered momentum. Elias could feel it in the vibrations, transmitted through the ice, thunderous rumbles that resonated like a distant heartbeat. He squeezed his eyes shut, recalling the guide's caution before they set out. The mountain yields no warnings twice. Respect her voice. Now he understood the meaning. He was locked beneath that voice, and his fate hung on deciphering its next whisper. Minutes passed in weighted silence. Elias fought the urge to scream, to pound at the ice above him. That would achieve nothing but hastening the cavern's collapse. Instead, he surveyed his surroundings. By touch-smooth walls overhead, irregular shards under his back, and the soft give of fresh snow pressed against his sides. He whispered his daughter's name, Mara, feeling the syllables vibrate in the empty space. Even in the heart of a glacier, love had the power to pierce the cold. He wondered if the guides had survived. Had they escaped down the slope, or had they too been caught in the avalanche's maw? The thought threatened to unravel what remained of his resolve. But he clung to the memory of Mara's grin, sunlight in human form, as a beacon in this frozen oubliette. Somewhere above the mountain, whispered again. Elias inhaled sharply, preparing himself for the long fight ahead. The storm's fury might bury him further, but within him, a firmer determination stirred. In the hush of the glacier, he resolved he would not slip quietly into darkness, not while the thin thread of life still pulsed within his chest. The mountain exhaled a low, ominous growl, as if stirred from a deep slumber moments before it unleashed its fury. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized the plateau beneath him shivered with barely perceptible tremors. He braced himself, gripping his ice axe so tightly that his knuckles blanched beneath the thin leather of his gloves. Then came the crack, a sound like the world itself, fracturing resonant and bone deep. It split the air with shocking abruptness, an acoustic blow that stole the breath from his lungs and reverberated up through his boots into his spine. A chorus of cracking followed jagged lines of fracture snaking across the snow above. He saw it in peripheral vision first. White powder loosed from the ridge, spiraling outward like the first whisper of an untold disaster. The guides shouted their voices, swallowed by the crescendoing roar as the avalanche hurled itself downhill. Elias's instincts catapulted him into motion, but time slowed. Each second stretched as though the mountain sought to savor its destruction. Snow exploded around him in a churning mass. The air filled with tiny ice shards that stung like hail against exposed skin. He struck out with his axe, but it caught only empty air as a wall of snow slammed into his chest. The force drove him backwards. His legs kicked futilely against the sliding surface, seeking purchase on a slope that no longer held firm. Gravity and momentum conspired to fling him forward, head first into the roaring torrent. The world dissolved into white noise and blinding light. For a fractured moment, Elias was weightless, suspended in a gale of ice crystals. The cold bit through every layer of clothing, shrieking against his skin. His limbs spun, disoriented, grasping at fellow climbers' ghostly forms, swallowed by the avalanche. He felt a violent shudder beneath him as the torrent gouged out a cavern, then a sudden drop. The ground fell away, and he plummeted into darkness. He struck the ice ceiling with a wet, echoing crack. Pain roared through his shoulder and down his arm. For a heartbeat, his senses recoiled. Then the world lurched once more, and he plunged deeper, tumbling into the cavern's hollow. Each collision jarred his bones, ribs rattling, a leg twisting beneath him. He landed on his back with a thunderous thud, snow slamming into the opening above and sealing out the storm's fury with a suffocating weight. Silence descended, absolute and cavernous. Only his own breathing persisted, ragged and echoing against the icy walls. White light filtered in through fine fissures overhead, painting the vaulted interior in ghostly patterns. Elias tried to move, but found his left shoulder pinned by a heavy slab of compacted snow. A dull ache spread across his chest. His vision swam. Each blink swept ice crystals onto his brow. He twisted his head, peering up at the fractured ceiling. Spikes of ice jutted downward like stalactites dripping melted beads that hissed against his clothing. Somewhere in the chaos, he felt his pack shift. Equipment clinked and clattered as it slid from his grasp. The reality of entrapment pressed in. He was isolated in this frozen coffin, miles from any rescue, buried beneath tons of avalanche debris. Panic flared bright and searing, but Elias quelled it with a practiced inhale. He focused on the cadence of his breath, matching inhale to exhale in a steady rhythm. He counted silently 1, 2, and 3, letting each number anchor him against the rising tide of terror. The cold pressed in, but his mind refused to follow. He summoned every shred of discipline he had honed on countless climbs, the lesson that clarity can outlast fear, that calm can reclaim the reins even when the body screams surrender. Reaching upwards, He swept his gloved hand across the ceiling, testing the texture of the ice. It was smooth and unyielding, save for a few small pits where granular snow had lodged. He banged his fist lightly, listening for hollow notes that might suggest a thin patch ready to yield. Nothing. Only the low hum of settling snow and the faint drip from overhead. He exhaled in a gust of frosty breath, the vapor curling into the gloom. His chest tightened. The air felt thick, stale. He turned his head mouth, rasping for any fresh pocket of oxygen. The cavern's shape revealed itself a narrow oval space, perhaps 8 feet long and barely wide enough to accommodate him. Above him, the ice ceiling arched in graceful curves, its underside a tapestry of striations and bubbles frozen in time. A cold dread crept up his spine as he realized how precariously he hung between survival and oblivion. A single misstep or too forceful a movement could trigger another collapse, sealing him in permanently. The avalanche's roar had faded, leaving only the whisper of shifting ice. Beside him, buried just out of reach, his ice axe lay half buried in snow. Beyond that, his pack, its bright orange fabric dulled by dusting powder. He tested the nearby floor with a careful sweep of his foot. Under the snow lay a ridge of ice, perhaps at the lip he could use as leverage. Biting back the pain in his shoulder, he twisted his hips and thrust his leg forward, hooking his boot on the ridge. The ice dug into the sole, offering a hold. Encouraged, he pushed his weight onto that foot, then lifted his torso, angling his body upward. The slab above him groaned, but held firm. Snow cascaded from the entrance, a whisper of movement that sent a fresh tremor through the ceiling. Elias froze, heart clattering in his ears. Above the surface, he had tumbled through shifted imperceptibly, a subtle settling. He reminded himself that panic would bring disaster. He retreated slightly, pressing his back against the far wall. His shoulders screamed, but he breathed through it, anchoring himself. The fracture line that had formed during the avalanche stretched across the ceiling like a scar. In the dim light, it glowed faintly, a track of weakness. He knew that even as the mountain stilled, tensions within the ice continued to shift. He needed to find stability or risk being crushed. Every inhalation was a small victory against the cold. Every exhale a warning of time slipping away. His fingers brushed against cold metal, the tip of his ice screw knocked from his belt during the fall. He squeezed it, sending a jolt of warmth through his palm. It was small, but it could offer purchase. Carefully, he freed it from the crust of snow, then leaned forward, using it to wedge a small indentation in the ice. The shaft scraped against the brittle surface, carving a shallow notch. It took 3 attempts before the screw held firm enough to support his weight. With a muted groan, he pushed upward on his good shoulder, testing his balance. Pain blossomed, but he ignored it. Inch by methodical inch, he climbed toward the entrance, the ice screw anchoring each shift. Above him, the world tumbled in and out of view, a thin line of gray sky mottled by clouds, a sliver of the ridge. It was both promise and taunt, a reminder that freedom lay just beyond reach. He paused to catch his breath, letting his arms tremble against exhaustion. His mind raised with the enormity of the task. To climb out meant navigating a collapsing ceiling in half darkness, with frostbite looming and no guarantee the ice would hold. Yet, in that moment, the memory of his daughter's laughter, bright and clear as a bell, ignited his resolve. He would not be lost to the mountain's appetite. With the screw as his lifeline, he steeled himself for the ascent, the weight of the avalanche's fury still echoing in his ears. The world within the ice was a study in contrasts, utterly still, yet charged with the threat of collapse, pitch dark, yet broken by shards of ghostly light. Elias pressed himself against the far wall of the cavern, every muscle wound tight against the cold. His chest tightened, the stale air in his lungs, a burden he could almost taste. He realized suddenly that he needed fresh air, not just to clear his head, but to survive. Above the fractured ceiling shimmered with tiny fissures that hinted at hidden air pockets beyond. He exhaled slowly, counting 3 beats, in 3 beats out, coaxing as much warmth as he could from each breath. The stale, recycled atmosphere inside the cavern was cooling rapidly around him, congealing moisture on his eyelashes. He glanced at the ice screw anchored above and knew he could rely on it to prevent a sudden collapse if he remained still. Yet stillness meant suffocation. Recognizing that untenable choice, he resolved to probe the ceiling for air. Elias flexed his aching shoulder before he moved, cautious not to disturb the fragile dome. He reached upward, fingertips grazing the cold surface. His glove snagged on a microscopic protrusion, and the palm of his hand pressed against the ice like a heat sink. Gingerly, he scraped at the edge of the fissure where pale light seeped through. Fine snow dust drifted down, and a tiny sliver of open sky peered back at him. He paused, inhaling the faintest breath of wind from above. His lungs rewarded him with the whisper of movement, a promise that fresh air lingered just beyond reach. But to access it, he would need to expand the opening, to carve a channel through which life could flow. He slid the ice screw free from the cavity for better leverage, its shaft slick with condensed frost. Returning his palm to the fissure, he nudged the screw gently into the fracture and twisted, widening the gap. The ice groaned softly, and shards fluttered to the floor like crystals falling in slow motion. As the opening grew, he felt a rush of colder, cleaner air buffeting his face, sharp and stinging. Elias braced himself against the sudden influx, chest rising to gulp down precious oxygen. Heat flared in his lungs, sending invigorating pulses through his veins. The movement, though minor, had taxed him. His shoulders pounded, legs trembled, but the reward was immediate. He could breathe deeply, drawing long, even breaths that filled him with renewed strength. He paused to rest the hiss of the wind above a soothing lullaby. The opening revealed a jagged silhouette of sky only a hand's breadth across, but enough to remind him of the world beyond the ice. He touched his fingertips to the cool air, letting it flood his senses. It carried the distant howl of wind and the faint patter of falling snow, life's symphony, beating against the cold wall of his chamber. Encouraged, he worked methodically to enlarge the aperture. The ice screw carved deeper grooves as he twisted it, clearing away brittle flakes. Overhead, the dome creaked ever so slightly, but the screw's notch held firm. His breathing slowed as he focused eyes, tracking each sliver of movement, ears attuned to any sound that might foretell a collapse. He reminded himself that the opening need only be large enough to vent air. He did not need to widen it into a doorway. 2 inches became 4, then 6. The light grew brighter, and the wind's chant swelled. Elias pressed his face close, using his exhalations to defrost the ice at the edge of the fissure. A thin layer of frozen breath cracked and dropped away. Every small fragment he cleared felt like a triumph proof that he could still influence his fate. Once the slit measured nearly 8 inches long, he pivoted his head back into the cavern and breathed deeply. The stale shadows recoiled at that influx, retreating as if startled by life's insistence. With fresh air circulating, the chill in his lungs receded, replaced by an invigorating burn. He felt the color return to his cheeks, though the rest of his body remained numb. He knew the effort had cost him energy he scarcely possessed, but he refused to yield. Scraping off his left glove, he pressed his bare palm to the ice to test the wider opening. The skin burned where it contacted freezing glass, but his senses sharpened. He could hear more now, distant shifting of ice, a faint echo of movement that suggested the avalanche above had settled into a new equilibrium. He closed his eyes, concentrated on that distant echo, and synchronized his breaths with its rhythm, a quiet partnership between man and mountain. In that moment of calm, a memory surfaced, a childhood camping trip beside a rushing river. His father had taught him to find the current's lull, the spot where the water's roar softened into a comforting hum. There, they would rest the river's heartbeat, guiding their breaths. Elias likened the avalanche's echo to that river, harsh yet hopeful, a reminder that life endures even in furious surroundings. As the cavern filled with cleaner air, his mind sharpened. He charted the next steps to keep that slit open, to search for other pockets of air that might indicate a thinner ice layer, and to ration his energy until he could attempt an escape. Strengthened by oxygen, he gathered the screw, wiped his brow even as frost formed on his eyelashes, and steadied his resolve. He tested the ice around the opening, tapping lightly with his knuckles to detect hollow chambers where air pockets might linger. At several points, his knuckles reverberated with a hollow ring. Imbued with a fresh surge of hope, he located the most promising spot, a shallow dome of ice that chimed like a bell under his touch. He wedged the screw there, turned it decisively, and felt a crack widen into a small pocket behind the ceiling. He inhaled sharply as a rush of air gushed through the new gap, like a door opening on the world beyond. It carried the scent of snow and ozone, a fragrance he equated with freedom. Elias lowered his head and drank greedily, his shoulders straightening as warmth bloomed in his lungs. Despite the danger, he allowed himself a moment of triumph. He had proven that life could still push against the mountain's cruel hold. Guided by the rhythm of his daughter's laughter, each measured breath became a pledge. As long as air flowed, hope remained, and with hope, he would continue to fight. A gentle warmth flickered at the edges of Elias's mind, tender and insistent, like the first glow of dawn through frost-rimed windows. Even as the cold gnawed deeper into his muscles, another force stirred beneath his ribs, memory sweet and achingly vivid. He closed his eyes, letting his breathing slow to a steady, meditative pulse. The cavern's icy embrace faded, replaced by the echo of a small voice full of delight. "Mama, look, I can do it." Mara's laughter, crystalline and bright, rang through the warmth of their living room. Elias saw her in his mind's eye, perched on the low beam of a backyard swing set, her pigtails flying like twin pennants in the breeze. He remembered the sun's golden slant at late afternoon casting long shadows across the grass. She balanced on that narrow beam with determined concentration, arms outstretched for an imaginary tightrope crossing, while her mother clapped and cheered. Elias allowed himself that moment of reprieve. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. He inhaled memory like a precious gift, letting it thaw the shards of ice in his chest. His scalp tingled as the blood pulsed, carrying warmth into areas he thought long dead to sensation. Hypothermia's creeping fog retreated at least a little, driven off by the bright spark of paternal pride that glowed in his mind. Mara. He whispered her name against the cold wall, and the word felt like a lifeline. In the memory, Mara paused mid-swing, her face lighting up at the sound of her father's encouragement. He bent forward, arms open, cheering her on. "You've got this, sweetheart." Just a little further, and she had one foot in front of the other until she lost her balance in a perfect giggling tumble into his arms. His chest ached at the recollection. He could almost smell the honeysuckle around their back fence. He remembered the way Mara's fingers curled around his thumb in trust, how her small body had pressed against his warm, safe, untroubled by the world's dangers. That image swelled in his mind, pushing back the darkness as ice crystals began to loosen their grip on his thoughts. A shiver rattled his spine, not from cold, but anticipation. Memory had sharpened his mind, reminding him why he had to survive. Mara's future, her need for him, her bright-eyed wonder was a beacon stronger than any flashlight or rescue team. He inhaled deeply, the cool air rushing over his lungs, and exhaled, clearing his thoughts for what lay ahead. Yet hypothermia still threatened. He felt its subtle currents, confusion at the edges of his concentration, a heaviness in his limbs, a tendency to drift between urgent alertness and foggy disorientation. He flexed each toe, each finger, yes, they still responded even if slowly. That was encouraging. He rubbed his hands together, creating friction that sparked small blossoms of heat. Then gingerly he pressed them to his cheeks, coaxing warmth toward his core. Another memory surfaced, Mara's bedtime ritual of story time. Her small lamp glowed softly as he read her a tale of dragons and distant kingdoms. He remembered the steadiness of his voice as he wove each sentence, the way she would tuck herself under the covers, eyes drifting closed as she imagined knights and fire-breathing beasts. Even the faint hiss of the radiator warmed those recollections. He could hear her soft snore at the story's end, and the way she pressed a damp crayon-drawn picture against his cheek before drifting off. He softened the corners of his thoughts around that nocturnal scene, letting its tranquility become a blanket around his psyche. Despite the icy prison around him, he felt a measure of serenity. He exhaled and sensed his chest cavity thawing, a small but vital victory. The fear of icy oblivion recoiled at the bright pulse of love. Beneath him, the floor of the cavern groaned as another lump of ice dropped from above. Elias startled, blinking, and his reverie cracked. He lay still, letting the afterimage of warmth recede enough to assess his surroundings. The slick ice beneath him reflected faint streaks of light from his slit to the sky. The screw he'd wedged into the ceiling glimmered with condensation. All remained as before life, teetering on a frozen edge. He inhaled again, steadying his thoughts. Memory had given him fuel. Now came the task of applying it. He needed to reinforce that air pocket, extend the fissure further, and find a way to dislodge the heavy slab pinning his shoulder. His mind's clarity, sharpened by the emotional anchor of his daughter, became a tool. He recognized that mental fog was hypothermia's first weapon. Memory and focus could be its antidote. Gathering resolve, he flexed his arm and tested the slab's edge. It quivered slightly under his touch, an encouraging sign. The ice, though thick and unyielding, was not immune to force. He removed his makeshift torch, his exhaled breath pressing warm air onto the block. As the ice at the contact melted, he shifted the screw's angle, using its serrated edge to carve a shallow groove. The task was slow, painstaking, but he persevered, recalling how patient he had been, teaching Mara to tie her shoelaces, one careful loop, one patient knot. Pain flared as he applied pressure, but he breathed through it, counting beats to steady his focus. Each groove he carved emitted a faint crack. Each crack offered the promise of movement. The ice shifted imperceptibly, loosening its grip on his shoulder. He exhaled his breaths, forming small clouds in the frozen chamber. Memory pulsed again, Mara's tiny hand slipping into his at an amusement park, her excitement at the roller coaster climb, followed by her squealed delight on the first drop. He remembered her gasp, the flush of her cheeks, the laugh he shared. The sensation of breeze against his face on that ride contrasted starkly with the suffocating cold here. Yet both experiences taught him about surrender and control, letting go at the right moment, holding fast when it mattered most. He redoubled his efforts, guiding the ice screw deeper, twisting it until the block wavered. Then, planting his foot firmly, he leaned in and pushed. The block cracked free with a sound like shattering glass. It fell away, revealing a narrow tunnel beyond. Elias exhaled in relief, tasting freedom on the air that rushed in. In that small aperture lay the path to escape, and more importantly, the promise of returning to Mara's smile. He paused, letting his mind reflect on that victory. Memory had been the spark. Action was the flame. Warming blood surged through his veins, banishing the numbness that had frozen his resolve. Ahead lay a corridor of ice and darkness, yet through it beckoned daylight and tears of joy. He inhaled deeply, pressing his bare palm once more on the ragged edges of the ice, testing its strength and knowing that each pulse of warmth was a step closer to his daughter's arms. Despite the small tunnel he'd just opened, Elias understood that the cavern beyond still represented an unknown danger. He clung for a moment to the fractured block's jagged edge, letting his lungs fill and empty with deep, deliberate breaths. The wind in the shaft carried the imperceptible scent of melting snow and the faint metallic tang of suspended ice. Every intake of air reminded him how close he remained to death and how much more furious the mountain's walls could become if dislodged. He pressed himself through the narrow aperture boots, scraping against sharp shards. Behind him, the larger chamber sighed as the displaced slab shifted, sending a fresh trickle of snow down the walls. Elias froze, pressing his back to the wall of ice chest heaving. In that instant, the cavern was alive. The very granite cold breath of the mountain seemed to speak through creaks, groans, and the whisper of falling crystals. Once the initial tremor passed, he ventured deeper into the passage. The tunnel angled slightly downward, guiding him back beneath the avalanche debris toward an unknown destination. He kept his hands anchored against the ice sides, fingertips curling around any irregularity for support. In the dim, filtered light from the small slit furniture of ice, stalactites and stalagmites rose and fell like the ruins of a long-abandoned cathedral. The passage was narrow, too narrow to turn around, but at least it promised movement. After a dozen cautious steps, his knee struck something yielding a hollow cavity in the wall just large enough to welcome his entire frame. Elias sank to his knees and then lowered himself onto his side, cradled by the cavity's walls. It was scarcely more than an 8-foot-wide alcove, a fractured refuge, he thought, but it felt miraculous. The cramped space offered a break from the tunnel's crushing confinement and granted a sliver of psychological respite. He leaned his head against the smooth ice, catching his breath as though inhaling the world's entire supply of oxygen. In the silence, he traced the outline of the space by touch. The alcove formed a shallow nook, its ceiling only inches above his head. The back wall curved in a gentle arc, the ice polished as if by centuries of wind. The floor was uneven, a mosaic of frozen ridges and soft snow patches. Elias stretched one arm forward, fingertips brushing against a crystalline protrusion that glowed faintly. He closed his eyes, marveling at the beauty of its facets, a natural chandelier hung in solitude. He flexed his aching legs. The cramped posture had relieved some pressure off his pinned shoulder, allowing him to test its range of movement without the fear of wedging it further. The pain still pulsed like a dull drumbeat, but at least it no longer felt immobilized. He circled his shoulders gently, listening for any complaint from the ice walls. All remained still, no fresh echoes of collapse. Safe, at least for the moment. With conscious effort, Elias shifted from survival mindset to evaluation. He spread out his equipment, a small headlamp, half-frozen water bladder energy bars, and a multi-tool kit. His fingers fumbled at first, numb from cold, but warmth from his core gradually returned feeling. He clicked on the lamp, its beam carving a halo in the alcove. Shadows danced across its curved surface, playing over the icy contours. He surveyed the space, narrow, but tall enough to crouch, solid enough to bear his weight if the walls held. In this grotto of ice, Elias felt the firmest ground he'd known in hours. His adrenaline still surged, but the drowning fear had eased into a focused determination. He refilled his lungs with fresh air, savoring each breath, and slid open the water bladder's spout. The water inside was half-frozen, icy crystals clinging to its sides. He tilted it, coaxing droplets free and letting them trickle into his mouth. The cold sting revitalized him, washing away the haze that hypothermia had begun to paint across his vision. Resting lightly against the wall, he flipped open the multi-tool. The small saw blade and knife blade glinted. He ran a fingertip along its serrations, imagining the sculpting possibilities if he could carve channels or polish an exit route. Though the alcove offered temporary relief, he knew it wasn't truly refuge. It was only the calm before the storm that the mountain might yet unleash. The avalanche above continued settling each granular shift, sending distant rumbles through the ice. He opened one energy bar wrapper, peeling it back to reveal a dense, nut-studded square. Raisins and seeds studded its surface. He tore off a corner, chewing with slow deliberation. Each bite carried a hint of sweetness and a jolt of protein-rich sustenance. He swallowed carefully, aware that fatigue dulled his senses. Nourishment couldn't defeat the cold, but it fortified his resolve. He gazed at the alcove's ceiling, its glassy curves reflecting his lamp's glow, like a silent sky full of distant stars. His mind drifted back to Mara. Her small hands had once shaped clay figures on their kitchen table, molding dragons and unicorns with determined concentration. Elias drew on that memory, letting the tactile rhythm of her play echo through his muscles. He closed his eyes, picturing her smile, her bright creativity, the way her eyes sparkled with wonder. It was an ember he could carry in his chest, tiny but fiercely hot. He leaned forward, examining the junction between the alcove and the tunnel's main passage. The ice there bulged outward slightly, a ridge that could guide him back to the surface passage. He traced its line with his fingers, a subtle arrow pointing upward. Beyond that ridge, perhaps the tunnel rose again. If he could navigate back through the narrowing corridor and then angle upward, he might find the fractured ceiling's original entry point. Flickering around the edges of his consciousness was the memory of his guiding lessons. Find stability before testing movement. He looked down at his pack, carefully lifting it and resting it against the alcove's back wall. Adjusting his shoulders, he took off his jacket for easier movement, an act of faith that he could redon it if the ice walls shifted. He unzipped the pack's exterior pocket, retrieving a small high-intensity flare and a space blanket. He considered igniting the flare to signal rescuers, but the flames might melt the ice around him disastrously. He instead tucked the flare inside his jacket pocket and folded the space blanket across his lap, using it as insulation. The alcove's safety allowed him to plan his next move. He tested the alcove's floor with a stamp of his boot solid. He tapped the side walls with the core of his palm resonant but not hollow. He exhaled a sigh that fogged the air for a moment, then cleared. He charted his intended route anchor, the ice screw back at the fissure, widen it if possible, then push through the passage and look for rising slopes. The angle would guide him to daylight and hopefully rescuers. Energy bar finished, water-consumed tools at hand. He sat up. Each movement was deliberate, no wasted effort. The alcove might collapse if he jostled it too much, so he kept contact points minimal, one hand on his ice axe boots, planted firmly. He drew his rope from the pack, attaching it to the ice anchor he had fashioned earlier. It felt brittle, but serviceable. If he needed leverage, he could use the rope as a lifeline, securing it around his waist or looping it to a sturdy ice feature. A final deep breath filled his lungs. He nodded to himself. The alcove had been a charged intermission between panic and continued battle. It was enough refuge to remind him that he still lived and could fight on. With that spark of confidence, he turned toward the tunnel's mouth and readied himself to push forward, stepping lightly so as not to disturb the fragile peace of his icy sanctuary. His heart thundered in his chest like a war drum, each beat reverberating through the narrow tunnel and slicing through the brittle quiet. Elias pressed his palm against his sternum, feeling the pulse tremor beneath his glove, a reminder that life still coursed through him. Yet the rhythm was accelerating, fear spiking into panic, fueled by exhaustion and the knowledge that every moment brought new peril. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat, inhaling deeply through the slit above to steady his breathing, then exhaled in a long hissing whisper that trailed behind him like a fading echo. Every step forward felt as though he carried the weight of the mountain on his back. His pack bit into his shoulders, the cold metal frame pressing into his spine. Ice-coated rope trailed behind him, and his ice axe scraped against the floor, chanting a metallic refrain. He leaned forward, planting each foot carefully to avoid slipping on the ice that glazed the tunnel walls. The narrow passage forced him into a hunched posture, his knuckles scraped against rough ice ridges, drawing thin lanes of crimson where the cold had cracked his skin. The pulse in his ears thundered even louder when he paused at a fork. Two passages diverged before him. One sloped gently upward, the other plunged deeper into darkness. He brought his hand to his brow, wiping a film of sweat that had formed despite the cold. A tightness seized his chest, doubt creeping in. Which way led to freedom, and which would become a deeper trap? He inhaled the cold air, letting it sharpen his focus. To his left, the downward tunnel descended into a void so dark he could not see its end. To his right, the upward slope glowed faintly, where stray light from the surface flickered through distant cracks. His rational mind argued for the light follow it, and he might breach the surface. But his instincts whispered caution tunnels at angle shifts were prone to collapse beneath the avalanche's pressure. He balanced on the balls of his feet, listening intently. The stillness pressed in like water in a vessel, every shift magnified. Then came a faint thrum, like the distant stroke of a bell or the pulse of a giant trapped beneath stones. It vibrated through the tunnel floor into the soles of his boots and resonated up his legs. He pressed his ear against the ice, heart hammering in response. The sound pulsed again, a slow but steady rhythm that matched his own heartbeat. Hope flickered. If that sound was human rescuers digging, probing, then he might not be alone. But the tunnel was wide enough that sounds could echo and amplify, tricking perception. He held still, every nerve taut, waiting for the next vibration. A soft scrape answered the pulse like metal prying at ice. His heart surged, disorienting him with conflicting sensations of relief and alarm. He wanted to shout to announce his presence, but his lungs balked at the idea. Every scream risked collapsing more ice. He pressed himself flat against the tunnel's side glove, cupped over his ear, straining to localize the noise. It seemed to come from the downward passage, an unsettling revelation. Why would someone dig deeper into the mountain's belly unless there was a secondary cavern or access shaft below? He slid his other hand along the wall, tracing its undulating curves. His fingertips brushed against a series of tiny holes molded in the ice air vents that suggested larger pockets beyond. Desperation clawed at him. He needed to decide. He let his pulse calm, forcing each inhale to outlast the exhale, counting to 5 on each draw and count to 5 on each release. Slowly the pounding receded, leaving a steady drumbeat that grounded him. His muddy breath whipped against the ice, gathering as frost around his nostrils. He chose the upward slope. Freedom lay above, not deeper, in the earth's womb. He pivoted on one boot, gripping his axe and digging the pick into the ice for stability. Then, almost reluctantly, he swung his leg around and placed his foot onto the upward path. Shards of blue-tinted ice bit into his soul, but he pushed forward. Each step was agony. Hypothermia crept through his body like a creeping vine, slowing his reactions, dulling his senses. His calves quivered, his thighs burned. He felt the familiar numbness around his lips and fingertips, a warning sign. His mind flickered with images, Mara's tiny hand slipping from his, the triumphant grin that had buoyed him before. He refused to let fog take over. He whispered her name again to steel his nerve. The tunnel drew him upward in a gentle incline, but the confined space made it steep. His harness brushed against the ceiling as he rose, sending sprinkles of powdered snow onto his shoulders. He swallowed hard, tasting cold steel on his tongue from the raft of metal gear clinking at his belt. His own breath sounded cavernous, as though another being exhaled beside him. Without warning, the ice beneath him groaned in protest. He froze, breath stalling in his throat. Vibrations ran beneath his boots, faint at first, then growing into a low rumble that shook the tunnel. Chimes of ice fell somewhere ahead, tinkling like glass wind chimes caught in a storm. Elias's heart lurched, but he forced himself to stay calm. Panic could kill. He glanced back briefly, seeing only the dark ribbon of the tunnel descending into oblivion. Then he turned forward again. He gripped his axe and ran the pick along the ceiling, testing its firmness. Small cracks spidered out, but no significant shifts. He let out a slow breath. Climbing, he reached a squeeze point where the tunnel's walls pressed in tighter. His shoulders scraped ice, and he paused, letting his pulse calm again. In that hush, the faint echo of digging reverberated the same odd thrum from before. Likely a rescuer's pick, perhaps another climber trapped or searching. The sound was a lifeline. He shouted, voice hoarse and ragged against the ice. "Hello, I'm here. Help." His words swallowed by the tunnel, but he dared to hope they carried. The echo folded them back, distant and faint. After a moment's pause, he shouted again, more urgent. Silence answered. Elias's heart plummeted, leaving an icy void. But then faintly came a reply. "Can you hear me?" The voice was muffled, but undeniably human and female. His throat tightened, tears threatened ice on his cheeks. He pressed his glove to the wall, feeling the low-frequency vibrations of her voice. Elias, he managed to rasp. His own name spoken back jolted his soul. Hold on. We're coming, the voice assured him. The tone was steady, professional, carrying warmth that seeped into his bones. Rescue. The word exploded hope through his veins, giving him the adrenaline to fight back exhaustion. He steadied himself against the wall, letting his knuckles press down to numb the cold. He could rest here just for a moment. His chest heaved as he inhaled the rhythmic echo of rescue efforts above him and felt his pulse slow to a confident tempo. He whispered silently, "Mara daddies, coming home to you," and let the words soothe his frayed heart. The drumbeat of his pulse softened into a steady march, guiding him onward through the mountain's icy labyrinth towards salvation. Elias's pulse hammered in time, with the distant digging and urgent drumbeat promising deliverance. Yet deliverance would depend on his own actions. He could not simply wait. He had to prepare. He drew the multi-tool from his belt and flicked open its pliers blade. With shaking fingers, he clipped the tether of his headlamp and uncoiled the cord, taking a moment to click it on. The weak LED beam cast a narrow cone of light, revealing the tunnel walls, shifting textures, ripples of compressed snow, jagged shards of ice, and faint stains where murky meltwater had seeped before freezing. He propped the lamp atop a protruding ice shelf, angling it to illuminate the ceiling and the ground ahead. Its steady glow offered orientation, a small beacon in the half-darkness that clawed at his mind. He turned back to his pack, which sat wedged against the wall where he'd left it in the alcove. With deliberate calm, he slid off the waterproof cover and unzipped the main compartment. Inside lay the remainder of his gear, a CO2 canister and mini pump for his climbing tool, 3 ice screws of varying lengths, spare gloves, nutritional gels, and a compact first aid kit. His fingers trembled as he selected an ice screw, gripping its shaft to warm the metal in his palm. The screws were his lifelines, anchors he could embed in the ice to secure himself or to brace a makeshift pulley system. Next, he extracted his mini pump and connected it to the CO2 cylinder, testing its valve. A soft hiss signaled that the seal held, promising the power to drive ice screws into unforgiving surfaces without manual effort, conserving precious strength. He tucked the remaining screws into a pocket within easy reach and returned the pump to his belt. Then he searched for his carabiners, 2 heavy-gauge clips that dangled from a loop beside his ice axe. He unhooked one and clipped it to the lash point of the pump, ensuring it would remain accessible. The other carabiner he attached to the loop of his belt so it wouldn't snag on the tunnel walls. Each piece of gear he organized flickered in his mind against the backdrop of his daughter's fearless grin, as if Mara herself supervised his preparations. He paused, breathing through the rhythm of his daughter's laughter echoing inside his head. The first aid kit beckoned with its promise of swift medical relief, antiseptic wipes, bandages, tweezers, and a small heat-activated emergency blanket. He pried it open and withdrew the blanket, a thin metallic sheet that could trap his body heat. Carefully, He tucked it around his waist, the crinkling material whispering against his layers as he repositioned it until it covered his lower torso. He knew this band of warmth would help stave off hypothermia's relentless creep. Then he focused on the nutritional gel's dense calories packaged in easy-to-squeeze pouches. He tore open one and squeezed the thick sweet paste into his mouth. The sugar surged through his system like a bolt of energy, brightening his vision and sharpening his focus. He swallowed with deliberate care, avoiding the icy spray that might freeze in his throat. A second gel followed, and with it came a tremor of hope. Fueled and fortified, he closed the kit and zipped it shut. His gaze returned to the headlamp, whose beam now shone unwaveringly into the tunnel's depths. It was a tool for guidance, but its battery was limited. He needed to extend its lifespan, so he clicked it off and back on in a flicker, gauging the reserve light. 2 hours at best, he estimated. The rescuers ahead could see that light, and he could see them provided he managed his resources wisely. Next, he retrieved the remainder of his rope tied in a coil. It was static climbing rope, 6 millimeters wide, strong enough to support his weight if necessary. He pulled free a length and tied a figure-8 knot at one end, creating a secure loop. He clipped this loop to the heavy carabiner on his belt. With a practiced flourish, he looped the rope under his arm and across his chest, anchoring it around the ice screw embedded above the initial fissure, his makeshift lifeline to the main chamber. It would prevent an accidental slide backward, especially if the ice gave beneath his boots. He paused, a hand resting on his ice axe. He'd used it instinctively in the Avalanche's chaos, but it was more than a weapon. It was an extension of his will. He rotated the axe in his grip, testing its pick and adze. There was a slight chip near the tip of the pick, a souvenir from a particularly hard placement days before. He pressed the pick gently into the ice floor, testing its bite. It held firm. Good. He knelt briefly, placing the CO2 pump against the icy floor and aligning the ice-to-screw's threads with a promising seam. Pressing the pump's lever, he felt the compressed gas drive the screw deep into the ice, the threads biting as they turned. He secured the pump's valve and removed it, leaving the screw locked in place. He fastened the rope's carabiner to the screw's eye, creating a secure anchor. A nod to himself affirmed that if the tunnel's roof collapsed or the floor slid, he had a tether to hold him. His pack lay open now, tools arrayed like instruments on an operating table. He zipped it halfway to prevent spillage of grit, but kept it accessible. Then he settled his headlamp back onto his helmet, clicking it on with a satisfying snap. As the beam illuminated the ice walls, he allowed himself a moment to appreciate the artistry of the glacier's interior. Striations carved by centuries of flow air bubbles, preserved like fossils. This was nature's cathedral, both beautiful and deadly. The distant scraping continued, punctuated by the rescuers' muffled shouts. Each sound brought Elias further out of himself, reuniting him with purpose. He hefted his pack, adjusted the straps, and inhaled the cold air in a steady draw. When he exhaled, his breath fogged the lens of the headlamp, momentarily dimming the light, a brief sign of his humanity amidst the machine-like environment. With gear organized and his tools within reach, he rose slowly, pressing his ice axe into the floor to lift himself. His legs, shaky but determined, responded. He tightened the rope's tension and took one cautious step forward, feeling the drill of tension in his anchor line. The tunnel's incline felt steeper now, each movement a negotiation between intent and the ice's mercurial grip. Before him lay the path to rescue, lit by his headlamp and guided by the echo of human endeavor. The tools of survival were in place: axes for carving screws, for anchoring rope, for securing gel, for fuel and warmth for his core. Each item represented a promise, a covenant between man and the unforgiving ice. Now, with everything prepared, Elias turned his face forward, letting the light guide his steps as he pressed toward salvation. The tunnel's walls narrowed as Elias pressed onward, guided by the beam of his headlamp, which carved concentric circles of light into the ice. Each step carried him deeper into the heart of the glacier, but also paradoxically closer to freedom. His rope tugged gently at his harness, a reminder of the anchor securing him to the world above. Beside him, the icy walls reflected his own blurred silhouette, a gaunt, determined figure, etched into a prism of cold. He came to a low arch, where the ice's underside curved gracefully, like the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral. Its surface shimmered with trapped bubbles and swirling blue veins, refracting his light into ghostly patterns that danced across the floor. Elias paused, mesmerized by the fractured reflections. He recognized something in them, a mirror of his own fractured state, wounded, battered, yet still gleaming with inner fire. He knelt and ran his gloved fingertips across the arch's slick surface, feeling the subtle ridges where the ice had buckled under pressure. The light above revealed a slim crack, thin as a hairline, through which a fleck of gray sky seeped. It was a window, a portal between his frozen realm and the storm's wrath outside. He pressed his palm against it, imagining the world beyond swirling snow, driving wind, and the promise of warmth beneath rescue blankets. His muddied breath fogged the glassy surface, and he blew it clear, watching droplets run down the curve and drip onto the floor. Each drop carried the weight of his longing for Mara's smile, for the sun on his face, for the taste of warm tea on an ordinary morning. The arch seemed to pulse beneath his touch, alive with the glacier's residual energy. Elias straightened, placing the ice axe's pick gently against the underside of the arch. With measured taps, he pried at the hairline crack, widening it just enough to let more light spill into the tunnel. Ice shards tinkled like chimes, and for a moment, the battered world above felt close enough to reach. He pictured the rescuers combing the debris, focused, disciplined hands plunging into drifts to find him. That image propelled him onward. Rising to his feet, he walked beneath the arch's span, following its curvature. Above him, the ceiling arced low. He ducked and stepped carefully, feeling the ancient weight of compressed snow overhead. Yet within that weight lay a paradoxical beauty, layers upon layers of history, each year's snowfall encased in gleaming resin. He let his lamp's beam trace the rings, appreciating the glacier's slow memory and drawing courage from its quiet persistence. As he moved forward, the light from above grew stronger, seeping in through tiny fissures. The fractured reflections multiplied on the tunnel's walls, prismatic shards of sky etched into brilliant spectrums. Elias paused, marveling, as blue and gray hues intermingled with the amber glow of his lamp. It was as though the mountain itself acknowledged his effort, offering glimpses of beauty, even in adversity. His boots crunched on a section of uneven ice where stalagmitic formations rose from the floor, the pale blue pillars like the ribs of a long-lost creature beneath the earth. He bent to pick up a small fragment that had broken free, an ice crystal the size of his palm. Under his lamp's glow, it shone like a diamond. He tucked it into a pocket near his heart, a talisman to remind him even in darkness there is light. Continuing beneath the arch, Elias encountered a narrow shaft of ice that jutted into the tunnel like a dagger. He placed his hand on it, feeling the pulse of the glacier as heat from his palm sent vapor curling along the edge. He chipped at its base with the adze carving a tiny notch. It yielded with surprising ease, a fleeting concession to his persistence. He used the resulting hole to attach a piece of rope, drawing another lifeline back toward the shaft's opposite wall. It was redundancy, another precaution, and proof that he would use every tool at his disposal. Ahead, the passage opened subtly into a broader chamber where the light from above spilled in through multiple cracks. Elias stepped into the glow, blinking, as the brightness erased the cavern's shadows. He raised his hand to shield his eyes, breathing in as though the light carried oxygen. This chamber felt different, spacious, almost gentle, compared to the claustrophobic tunnel. His heart swelled with cautious optimism. He moved to the chamber's far wall, where a wide fissure yawned upward at a steep angle. Through it, a bright curtain of gray light poured in, stained by drifting snow. Elias recognized the angle. It mirrored the original crevasse where the avalanche had thrown him. This must be the same shaft, now partially cleared by his chiseling and the rescuer's efforts. The surface beckoned with promise. Follow that fissure, and he would breach the ice's tyranny. He swallowed, tasting the metallic edge of adrenaline. He flicked on his headlamp, continuously illuminating the channel. Then he planted the ice axe's pick into the ice beside the fissure, testing its hold. Satisfied, he swung his leg upward, placing his foot onto the steep, icy lip. His calf protested, but he forced himself to climb, using the axe and crampons to inch upward. As he ascended, his gaze caught the fractured reflections overhead, a kaleidoscope of color that shifted with every movement. Streaks of sapphire and jade flecks of rust red, where sediment lay frozen within the ice, swirled in prismatic patterns. It was a private aurora borealis, trapped in the glacier's heart. Elias felt both humbled and invigorated by its silent grandeur. He continued upward, breath hissing as he found each hold. The icy walls shone like glass, and he imagined Mara peering through a similar window, wide-eyed with wonder at a natural wonder. He wanted to show her this sight, to share the fragile art of survival. That thought lent him strength in each calculated motion. Foot by foot, the fissure widened. Light grew brighter. The air shifted, carrying hints of wind and the distant rumble of shifting snow. Elias inched his head toward the opening and caught a glimpse of swirling white, a liquid sky churning outside. He inhaled deeply, letting that fresh wind fill his lungs. For the first time since the avalanche, the taste of open air was sweet and biting like freedom distilled. He planted his axe one final time, pulled himself up, and thrust his shoulder into the gap. The ice cracked under his effort, and a cascade of snow tumbled down the shaft into the chamber below, scattering like pearls across a marble floor. Elias's boot found purchase on a narrow ledge, and he heaved himself through the opening chest, first gasping as he emerged into the storm's gray swirl. He lay face down on fresh snow arms, splayed chest heaving with triumph. Above him, the mountain's ridgeline loomed, and beyond that, the gray sky danced with snowflakes. His headlamp lay on the snow beside him, its beam fading toward his heartbeat. He spat out a mouthful of icy grit, then turned his face into the wind, eyes closed in relief. Elias rose on trembling legs, dusted his pack free of ice, and looked back at the fissure he had just conquered. It glittered invitingly in the half-light, an open artery between his frozen tomb and the breathing world. He inhaled deeply, tasting freedom's crisp edge, and took a tentative step forward, each crunch underfoot a victory lap. In that moment, surrounded by storm and sky, Elias saw himself reflected in the fractured window. Behind him, a survivor, battered but unbroken, stepping out of darkness and back into life. Pain flared like molten iron through Elias's arm as he forced himself deeper into the cavern's twisting abysses. Each movement sent fresh agony coursing through his chest where ribs had cracked beneath the avalanche's impact. He bit back a cry, teeth grazing ice-cold air, and pressed on. The narrow tunnel opened into a low-ceilinged chamber whose walls glinted with veined blue ice. Frostbite had claimed the tips of his fingers, leaving them numb, white stumps that he could barely flex. Yet his mind refused to surrender to the creeping fog that blurred the edges of his vision. He leaned on his ice axe, its pick embedded in the floor, for support, and took in ragged, uneven breaths. Each inhalation sent shards of pain rattling through his lungs. Each exhale sprayed a frosty plume into the dim gloom. He willed himself to focus on the steady rhythm of breathing, matching inhale to exhale in a deliberate 1-2-3 count. Hypothermia's haze tried to dull his senses, whispering that the cold offered peace in oblivion. But in the back of his mind, Mara's laughter rang clear as bells bright defiance against despair. In the chamber's center lay a mound of broken ice and powdery snow, a collapse from the ceiling above. Its jagged fragments formed a treacherous field. Elias surveyed the debris, weighing his options. Circumventing it meant risking further injury. Climbing over it threatened dislodging unstable slabs. He closed his eyes, recalling lessons from years of climbing. Never fight the mountain's shapework with it. He chose to skirt the piled shards, crawling on all fours, gloved hands, scraping the tunnel floor. The ice felt like glass against his palms, each scrape sending fresh stabs of cold. He paused when a fragment bit into his palm, drawing a thin rivulet of crimson that instantly froze. Shadows danced on the walls as his headlamp bobbed with each movement. Elias forced his mind back to the task. He scanned the chamber for any sign of air pockets, subtle hollow rings under his knuckles, tiny drips from the ceiling. He located a cluster of faint holes near the north wall. Crawling forward, he pressed his ear against the ice. A faint breeze whispered through promising fresh air beyond. Energized, he planted an ice screw above the hole and used the CO2 pump to drive it home. The metal bit into ice with a hollow thunk. He tied a loop of rope to the screw's eye, planning to use it as a guide back if he ventured deeper. But fortifying his position was only half the battle. He needed to advance. He rose to one knee, staggering as his leg threatened to give way. The ache in his thigh pulsed with each heartbeat. He gritted his teeth and thrust himself upright, ice axe planted for balance. 1 foot, then the other, inch by inch, he inched toward the northeast tunnel that beckoned from the chamber's edge. Fear and pain clashed in his veins, but his will cemented, refusing to yield. The tunnel narrowed again, forcing Elias to lean forward. His crampons scraped the floor's ice ridges, and he gripped the walls with both hands to steady himself. Every joint protested. He reached a turn in the passage where the temperature dropped further. His breath crystallized on his eyelashes, frosting them into brittle bristles. He brushed them free, the arm movement causing his shoulder to crack in protest. The pain radiated like wildfire, but also sharpened his senses. He placed his hand on the ceiling, feeling its frigid pulse, and picked a path around jagged protrusions. Then the ceiling moaned a low, mournful groan that reverberated through the chamber. Elias froze, heart pounding. He pressed himself flat against the wall, careful not to dislodge any ice. The moan deepened, and tiny shards tinkled onto the floor like crystal rain. The mountain was alive, its breath a warning that time and stability were fleeting. He counted 3 breaths, then slipped his rope loop over a stable-looking spike of ice above his head, anchoring his lifeline. Even if the ceiling gave way, he would not tumble into the void unrestrained. He pressed forward again, the rope trailing behind like a lifeline to himself. Fatigue sagged in his bones, but he pushed through the wall of exhaustion, invocation of Mara's face fueling each stride. He pictured her clapping as she learned to ride her bike, tireless determination shining from her small body. He clung to that image as he entered a final sloping descent, an icy chute leading downward into deeper shadow. Gravity tugged him, sending him sliding on his rear at first, until he used his axe to break digging pick into ice. He levered himself to his feet and trudged on. The rhythm of his steps slowed to a weary plod breath, hissing and crackling as it froze around his lips. The final stretch felt endless, the walls closing in as if demanding he choose oblivion. But a faint spring in the wind brushed his cheek, a hint of less stagnant air. He followed that breath, pacing his steps with newfound urgency. At last, the tunnel broadened into an oval shaft, where light flickered through multiple fissures, signs that the surface was near. Pain erupted in his legs each step, a gamble between progress and collapse. He slipped twice, catching himself with his axe, until his hands shook too much to grip firmly. With a roar of effort, he thrust one last surge upward, digging in his crampons, heaving on his arms. The shaft gave way to a horizon of faint gray light, and Elias pressed his shoulder into the ragged ice lip. Cracks splintered overhead. He inhaled lungs burning and pushed again. Above the ice wall's underside shimmered before quivering, then caved inward in a torrent of snow and shards. Elias tumbled forward through the gap, rolling onto the surface beyond. White snow enveloped him, cold biting, but life-affirming. He lay still for a moment, the ache in every limb, a testament to survival. Fresh air filled his lungs, carrying the distant promise of voices, human voices, and warmth. The cavern's hush pressed against Elias like a weight, but beneath that silence, he sensed something new, a distant murmur, faint and fragmented, as though carried on a thin wire from another world. He froze, each breath caught between hope and disbelief. Again, a soft shout muffled by tons of ice and snow reached his ears. It felt impossibly close, yet agonizingly out of reach. Elias pressed his ear to the icy wall, fingertips trembling against its frost-hardened surface. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Over here, I can see your light." It was distant, a brittle echo bouncing through winding tunnels, but undeniably human. His heart surged, hammering against his ribs with pound-for-pound determination. Rescue. He scrambled back toward the fissure he'd painstakingly carved, limbs stiff and punishingly weighted by cold. Each movement rang out in the cavern, a staccato of desperation. "I'm here," he rasped, voice raw, as he pressed his torch against the ice. "Help me." Footfalls answered, faint, irregular. Elias's pulse thundered. He shifted the beam of his headlamp through cracks overhead, sending shafts of light dancing across vaulted ceilings. The voices murmured again, lower this time, tinged with urgency. "Hang on, we're clearing the debris." He banged his ice axe against the ceiling's underside, each strike echoing like a signal drum. Small fragments tinkled down, releasing a cascade of sound into the tunnel. "That's me up here," he shouted, voice brittle but unwavering. The voices paused, then louder. "We hear you. Keep tapping." Elias began a steady rhythm, wood of the ice axe, striking ice. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap. It was staccato Morse against the ice barrier. With each tap, his hope crystallized. He counted the beats in his mind, using them as a lifeline back to the world above. Between strikes, he listened. The rescuers worked tirelessly, their tools scraping and grinding the avalanche's frozen rubble, shifting with each blow. Elias imagined them on the surface, fellow climbers, guides, medics, hooded figures braving the storm to reach him. A tremor of gratitude warmed the cold that had leached into his bones. The wall shuddered. Then a hollow hummed in response. He pressed his palm against the quivering ice. "I'm at the main chamber," he called, voice urgent. 20 feet in, narrow passage. The voices answered, cautious but determined. "Roger that. Keep safe. We're cutting through." Elias exhaled a breath that fogged the ice, and he leaned back, settling onto a block of frozen snow. He flexed his numb fingers, then clenched them into fists against the floor, pushing warmth back into his core. Each breath burned, but now it carried the fierce heat of imminent salvation. "Your light's flickering," a new voice observed closer now. "Do you have a stronger beam?" Elias reached behind him, for his multi-tool fumbling for the CO2 pump he'd used earlier. "I have a pump ice screws," he managed. "I can anchor something if that helps." The rescuers' voices exchanged rapid words. "Then stay put. We'll break through above you and then lower a rope." Time became elastic. The sounds of cutting and prying echoed against ice walls, punctuated by metallic groans and the rhythmic chatter of excited, relieved voices. Elias tried to keep his breathing steady, matching inhale to exhale in a careful count. His teeth chattered not from cold alone, but from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He banged again, tap, 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 and the voices grew louder, as if stepping closer behind the barrier. "We see." The ice seam cracking, one voice reported. "Hold on, we're almost through." Elias pressed his forehead against the ice, tears freezing on his cheeks. "I'm right here," he whispered fervently. With a final groan, the ice seam yielded. A rectangular hole splintered open above him, widening fast. Fragments of ice rained down like gleaming rain. Elias shielded his face instinctively, then peered upward through the jagged aperture. A beam of gray light, diffuse storm-swirled, cut into the cavern's gloom. Above that, he glimpsed a gloved hand holding a rescue rope. "Grab it," a voice commanded. Elias stretched out a frost-numbed arm, fingers brushing the knotted loop. He grasped it, ice crackling beneath his grip. The rescuer's hands gripped his, hauling him upward through the crumbling hatch. He kicked out, pushing his feet against the ice wall, and felt himself pulled free of the chamber's icy clutches. He burst through the opening, gasping in raw, frost-kissed air. The storm's roar filled his ears, wind-whipping snow into whirling halos. Strong arms wrapped around his shoulders, steadying him. Above, a group of guides and medics peered down, their faces streaked with sweat and snow, but alight with relief. "Elias, we've got you," they cried, hauling him onto solid ground. He lay on his back chest, heaving, head tilted back into a swirling vortex of gray and white. Around him, rescue lights bobbed through the storm. He felt warmth pressing against his back, a blanket wrapped across his shoulders. His breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale a plume of hope. The voices continued softer now, coaxing him to move. "You're safe," they assured him. "We'll get you home." Elias closed his eyes, letting the world blur. The cavern's primal fear dissolved, replaced by the steadfast hum of human compassion. He whispered a final thanks into the wind, his voice barely audible. "Thank you." A single shield of light pierced the icy gloom, a slender lance of gray-white that fell like a promise across the cavern floor. Elias froze the moment he saw it, a beam unbroken by shadow, cutting through the frozen air and landing on a jagged spur of ice. The light trembled as it descended, flickering where the overhead fissure wavered in the wind. His heart thundered at the sight. After hours of stifling darkness, this fragile ray was the world's invitation to return. He rose on unsteady legs, each step a challenge, as exhaustion and pain vied for control. His boots crunched against frozen snow dust that glowed where the beam hit it, each particle catching the light and scattering it like a field of miniature stars. Elias accepted the hush of hope that settled around him, a hush that felt warmer than the frigid air. He inhaled deeply, drawing the beam's chill, into his lungs, letting it energize the brittle remains of his strength. The fissure overhead was narrow, no wider than his forearm, but it offered a glimpse of the storm-racked world above. He pressed himself beneath it, reaching upward until the light sketched every contour of his face. Frost caked his hair, and beard and icicles clung to his lashes. Yet in his eyes, the beam ignited a fire that burned away fatigue. He crouched, bracing his ice axe against the sloping ice beneath the crack. The angle was steep, perhaps 40 degrees, and the surface sparkled with a treacherous glaze. Elias tested the axe's pick against the ice, feeling it bite firmly. He then kicked a front point of his crampon, hearing the metal catch with a satisfying ring. It was enough to bear his weight. He exhaled slowly, counting each breath as he would instruct Anise inhale, calm exhale, control. Elias drove the second pick home, shifting his weight upward. The beam of light elongated across his chest, and he felt a surge of warmth spread through his lungs. He pulled one arm free, using the axe to carve a shallow notch in the ceiling's edge. The ice gave grudgingly flaking in gray chips that fell like ash. He dropped them into the cavern below, where they shattered in soft clinks. Every movement demanded everything he had. His left shoulder pulsed with every heave, the ribs beneath threatening to crack anew. Each breath stabbed his side, but he suppressed the wince. Pain was his companion, now a necessary reminder that he was still alive. He willed it into submission, focusing on the beam's steady glow. He kicked again, driving his other crampon into the slope at hip height. The holds felt secure. His arms, burning with cold-induced fatigue, trembled as he hoisted himself upward. The fissure widened only marginally, but enough. Elias saw the outline of sky, a shifting mass of dark clouds drifting across a pale expanse. He felt the wind's distant howl, a restless voice that beckoned him home. With each inch gained, the beam glittered more fiercely, refracting into prismatic shards that danced across his clothing. He thought of Mara's eyes when she gazed at rainbows in the sky, how the world's color fascinated her. Now those colors lived in ice. He let that thought bolster him, imagining Mara there beside him, cheering each upward inch. He reached the beam's midpoint, where the walls on either side pinched together narrowly. His back brushed the ice, sending a ripple of frost across his spine. He pivoted carefully, angling his body sideways, and pulled both axes free to reposition them above his head. A flurry of gray chips showered him, clattering against the walls. He bent his knees, driving the front points of his crampons higher, and stood in a compact crouch. A sudden tremor quivered beneath his boots, an echo of ice shifting above. A shard rattled loose in the crack and clattered down, jolting Elias's knuckles where they gripped the axes. He fought the spike of panic, recalling every practice drill anchor test move. He tested one pick, then the other, then drove both deeper until the axes were unyielding. Feet secure, he straightened his legs, pushing his hips upward. The fissure widened just enough for his torso to tip forward into the opening. Cold wind gusted in, buffeting his face and sending snow crystals stinging his cheeks. He gasped, letting the wind fill his lungs with a bracing burn. His breath came in ragged plumes that shimmered in the light like fleeting ghosts. He drew his legs up, planting his heels against the ice edge. 1, 2, he kicked, pushing himself upward until his shoulders squared in the crack. The beam of daylight glowed on his chest, illuminating the sweat and frost that battled for supremacy on his clothing. He extended an arm, fingertips brushing the wretchedly sharp edge of the ceiling. His gloves snagged, tearing a thread, but the grip held. He lifted his left leg, searching for a purchase beyond the fissure's lip. Snow packed in the crack offered enough friction. He pressed his calf against the ice, feeling the weave of fibers in his trousers freeze solid. With a grunt of effort, he shoved his body through, sliding the rest of his torso into the opening. The wind slammed him, toppling his head back and gouging a gasp from his lips. He tumbled forward, rolling in the fresh snow outside. Pain shot through every joint, but he lay still for a heartbeat, letting gravity and storm cradle him. His jacket soaked up moisture, then froze against his back. Elias blinked up at the swirling sky, each blink a victory against the storm's fury. The fissure glowed behind him, its edges serrated like the maw of a great beast he'd just escaped. Yet now it felt like a door sealed shut, a barrier between darkness and freedom. He pushed himself to all fours, then rose shakily to his feet. The beam of light that had guided him lay behind his shoulder, a triumphant arc of promise. The storm roared bullets of snow pelting him, yet he smiled through chattering teeth. Pain and cold might try to strip him of humanity, but the spark of hope burned brighter than any winter gale. He planted his ice axe in the drift, marking the spot. The tool's handle created a small upright cross in the snow, his monument to survival. Elias adjusted his helmet, brushed snow from his goggles, and took a step forward into the relentless wind. Each footfall sank deep, dragging him toward the sound of human voices beyond the ridge. Above the beam flickered one last time, before fading behind the ice's edge. Elias paused, bowing his head in silent gratitude to the shaft of light that had carried him. Then he raised his face to the storm and strode forward, every movement a testament to endurance, love, and the fragile miracle of a single ray of hope. Elias paused at the crest of the ridge wind, whipping snow into ghostly eddies around him, and stared back at the fissure's jagged mouth. In the gray half-light, it looked like the cracked shell of some primordial creature, an icy husk he had clawed his way through. His breath caught as fatigue threatened to overwhelm him, but he steadied himself. Now came the final labors, breaking through the last barriers between him and safety. He scanned the ridge's crest for tools. His ice axe stood at hand, its pick still firm in the drift. But he needed something smaller, more precise, to chip away stubborn ice. Recalling the shard he pocketed earlier, he reached inside his jacket and withdrew a chunk of translucent crystal, roughly 3 inches long, edges sharp as razors. It was a gift from the glacier's interior, a reminder that beauty and danger were 2 sides of the same frozen coin. He knelt in the drift and set the shard on the snow. The wind roared overhead, but here at ground level, it softened to a distant hum. Elias pressed gloved fingers against the shard's cool surface, feeling its smooth facets hum with latent energy. With a deep, steadying breath, he strapped on his headlamp again, its beam cutting a cone of light around his workspace. He examined the ridge ahead, a thick lip of ice heavily glazed and smooth, blocking the way to a gentler slope beyond. That lip must yield to his efforts. If he could thin it, weaken it, he could push it apart or carve a passage wide enough to edge through. He wiped frost from the shard's edge and tested its bite against a small protrusion. The crystal carved a shallow groove with a solid chime. Encouraged, he set to work. Positioning himself beside the ridge, Elias drove the shard's point into the ice, twisting it deliberately. Tiny flakes spalled off, tinkling down the far side like wind chimes. Each chip echoed his heartbeat, a metronome in the storm's symphony. He worked methodically, carving parallel notches about an inch apart, widening and deepening them with every pass. The cold bit into his hands through his gloves, but he ignored the numbing chill. Each chip demanded focus too forceful, and the ice could shatter unpredictably. Too light and progress would stall. He synchronized his strikes to his breathing inhale, chip, chip, exhale, turning the grueling work into a kind of icy dance. His legs burned from standing braced against the drift, but he shifted weight from foot to stave off cramps. After a dozen strokes, a narrow channel took shape. He tested the ice's thickness by tapping with the shard's flat side. The note was brittle, thin evidence that the ridge's core was giving way. Elias exhaled sharply, steam billowing from his lips, and redoubled his efforts, carving deeper into the channel. Above, the wind's howl deepened, pushing him to work faster. Snow drifted into his eyes, but he refused to pause until the channel reached half an inch in width. The variation in chime tones under the shard's tap told him that he was moving from dense ice into more porous layers. Progress accelerated as those brittle layers crumbled easily. A sharp crack split the air, a sound so loud it stung his ears. He glanced up to see a triangular slab of ice detach above the channel, its edges splintered. The slab shuddered before plunging to the slope below, where it shattered in a cascade of glittering fragments. Elias's heart leapt. He'd worked through the lip's weakest point. He rushed to press his body against the thinning ridge, bracing with his ice axe pick. The shard lay at hand. He seized it and drove it into the newly formed channel. With a grunt of effort, he twisted sharply, widening the gap. The ice cracked and groaned like a gate opening. He pressed again, and the two sides parted by an inch, enough to slip a gloved finger through. He slid the shard aside and wrapped his hand around the ridge's interior, testing its thickness. His fingertips brushed against compacted snow inside the breach. He scraped at it with the shard, clearing out the loose material. The gap widened further, and a slender streak of light from the slope beyond seeped through. Elias took a moment to rest, pressing his forehead against the ridge and closing his eyes. His breathing steadied into a calm rhythm. The storm's wind felt less oppressive here, as if compressed against the barrier had lost some of its fury. He inhaled in measured draughts of cold air, letting the shreds of fatigue recede. Then, gathering resolve, he rose to his full height. He shoved both hands into the gap and inched his torso forward, slipping through the narrow breach like a diver emerging from beneath ice. His jacket snagged momentarily, and the shard clattered to the snow. He freed himself with a twist and pulled his shoulders through the opening. With a final push, his legs followed, and he spilled out onto the gentler slope beyond. Fresh wind lashed his face, stinging with the taste of snow. He stood upright and surveyed the ridge from the other side, a narrow torn seam in the ice that glowed faintly where daylight seeped in. He retrieved the shard, pocketed it once more, and brushed snow from his pack. Relief and triumph surged through him in equal measure. He tested his footing on the slope, which angled gently downward toward the camp area. The wind remained harsh, but each breath felt freer. His clothes were stiff with ice, but none of his limbs were immobilized. His legs wobbled at first, then firmed as he adjusted. He paused to run a gloved hand across the breached ridge's lip, feeling the smooth surfaces he had carved. The shard's scars glimmered like calligraphy etched into glass. He marveled at the change he'd wrought. What was once an impregnable barrier now stood split, a testament to human determination and the power of a single tool wielded with precision. Elias took a final inhalation of the storm air and set off down the slope, each stride carrying him farther from the frozen shell he had shattered. The path ahead lay clear, well-trodden snowfields, leading toward the distant shapes of tents and figures. Behind him, the ridge stood open, a silent monument to his perseverance. Elias paused at the crest. The storm's roar reduced to a distant anthem, and watched his breath plume in the cold air. Every muscle ached, yet he felt the stirrings of a resurgence, an ember of will that refused to die. Beyond the ridge lay the camp, its lantern lights flickering through swirling snow, but between him and those lights stretched a gauntlet of icy fields and hidden traps. He tightened the straps on his pack, checked his ice axe's pick one last time, and stepped forward into the desolate expanse. The snow underfoot had hardened into slick crust, deceptive in its firmness. Elias tested each step with the adze of his axe, listening for hollow echoes that might betray concealed crevasses. At one spot, a muted thud echoed beneath his probe. He paused, heart jangling, then dug deep, with the axe carving a test slot. The crust gave way to a yawning void. Elias withdrew quickly, the pick's teeth catching on the edge. He dropped a short length of rope into the crevasse and tied it off, marking the danger zone. Ahead, these hidden fissures stretched unseen nature's snares laid beneath the pristine surface. He continued weaving a careful path around the marked crevasse, each footfall deliberate. The cold wind had eased to a whisper, but the sky remained overcast, muting all color. Elias thought of Mara's love of color, the way sunlight played on her hair, how her laughter painted rainbows in his memory. He imagined her here now, stenciled shadows dancing on the ice like her pigtails in the sun. That memory spurred him onward, giving purpose to every cautious step. After 20 minutes of painstaking navigation, Elias reached a plateau where the slope leveled. He set down his pack and retrieved his remaining energy gels. Hands trembling, he tore open a pouch and let the thick, sweet gel flood his mouth. It burned with sugary warmth, chasing away the numbness in his throat. He swallowed, bracing against the cold bite, then repeated the ritual with the second pouch. Each gulp refueled him a visceral reminder of life's simple pleasures. A cold storm couldn't steal every joy. Hydrated enough to move comfortably, he swapped the empty pouches for a sealed canister of warm electrolyte solution from his pack's side pocket. He twisted off the cap allies in his fight against hypothermia. A long sip revitalized his core, sending prickles of warmth toward his fingertips. He closed his eyes against the wind, savoring the taste of survival. Refueled Elias hoisted his pack onto his shoulders and resumed his trek. The plateau ended at a steep drop, an ice chute carved by winter avalanches passed. It funneled down toward a broader valley where the camp sat sheltered against a rocky outcrop. With a calculating glance, Elias assessed the chute's angle. It was steep but stable, its ice smooth and free of snowdrifts. He sheathed his axe, clipped the heavy carabiner of his rope to his harness, and positioned himself at the chute's rim. He anchored his rope to an ice screw planted in the plateau's edge. It held with a reassuring click. Then he braced the axe's pick into the ice and tested his crampons. Steady. Elias ran his gloved hand along the rope, feeling its taut strength. With a deep breath, he leaned back into the rope's tension and began his controlled descent. The slope pulled him downward in a smooth slide. His axe's adze bit into the ice, slowing his momentum, while his crampons dug rhythmic steps. The wind rushed past his face, and the gray light from above streamed down, illuminating the chute's walls in ghostly relief. Ice crystals sparkled where his rope cut shallow grooves. He focused on the simple mechanic's axe, crampon rope breath, a loop of survival. Midway down the rope, snagged briefly on a hidden spike of ice. Elias's heart skipped, but he remained calm, cutting his gaze to the snag point, shifting his weight, and tugging firmly until the rope loosened. No panic, he reminded himself. Even the smallest scare could cost him his equilibrium. He continued, every muscle engaged in the precise dance of controlled descent. At the chute's base, he hooked his axe to the screw, unclipped the rope, and coiled it neatly. Below lay the valley floor, a sweeping field of packed snow wrapping around the rocky shelter. Lantern light glowed faintly, and the silhouettes of camp tents stood like watchful guardians. Relief surged in his chest, and he broke into a careful jog legs, burning with the sudden burst of speed. As Elias approached, his guides emerged from the largest tent, their forms blurred by blowing snow. They waved, voices lost to the wind, but visible in their gestures. He quickened his pace each step, stirring the powder into fleeting trails behind him. Behind them, the mess tent's door flapped open, spilling warm amber light across the white expanse. He crossed the final stretch, stumbling slightly, before the guides caught him in a web of arms. Blankets enveloped him, the coarse wool pressed against his face, and he inhaled the scent of wood smoke and bread. The camp's medic knelt, inspecting his frostbitten fingers and writing burns. She whispered reassurances as she wrapped his hands in heated wraps. Elias looked up through frosty lashes into the stubbled faces of the team who'd risked everything to reach him. Gratitude blurred his vision. He managed a nod and a hoarse "thank you," His voice cracked, but carried the weight of every frozen heartbeat and every desperate breath. They guided him into the mess tent, where warmth wrapped around him like a second skin. At a table stood a steaming mug of broth, rich, salted, and fragrant. He lifted it with trembling hands, the mug's heat searing his palms. First sip brought tears, warmth, relief, life. The storm's howl muffled behind thick canvas as he leaned back, letting the world slow around him. Outside, the mountain's fury raged on, but inside, Elias tasted sanctuary warmth, safety, human kindness. He closed his eyes, cradling the mug like a priceless gift. Mara's face flickered in his mind, her favorite poem, her shy grin, and he knew he would tell her this story one day. But for now, he simply breathed alive, wounded, and profoundly grateful. The mess tent's warmth enveloped Elias like a mother's embrace, its canvas walls quivering as the storm's howl pounded outside. Guides and medics bustled around him, voices soft and urgent, tending to each injury with practiced efficiency. Blankets layered across his shoulders provided the first real feeling of comfort he'd known since the avalanche, their coarse wool trapping the heat that seeped back into his chilled muscles. A medic knelt before him, unwrapping his frozen gloves, one finger at a time. Elias flexed each digit as she massaged warmth into his fingertips, wincing but determined. Careful, she murmured, these are delicate. He nodded, watching steam rise from her warmed compresses. The dull ache in his left shoulder flared when she pressed, but he gritted his teeth and endured, sensing that every pang signified survival. Behind the medic, a guide handed him a mug of hot broth and urged him to sip. The rich, savory liquid slid down his throat in heated rivulets, igniting his core with renewed life. He closed his eyes, savoring the taste, salted just so flecked with tender bits of dehydrated vegetables and beef. Each sip felt sacramental, an offering to the gods of the mountain who had spared him. Elias lifted his gaze to the circle of faces around him, the head guide, his teammate, who'd first called his name through the ice, the medic, whose calm touch had coaxed him back, and two other climbers he recognized, breathless with relief. Their eyes glistened with tears and fatigue, but above all, gratitude. He offered a small, shaky smile. "Welcome back," the head guide said quietly, placing a firm hand on Elias's shoulder. "We thought we'd lost you." Elias swallowed past the lump in his throat. "Thank you," he rasped, voice thick with emotion. "All of you." The guide nodded, eyes soft. Behind them, another pair of rescuers unpacked heated water bottles and prepared an emergency shelter for the night. Despite the warm tent temperatures would plummet once the fire inside cooled, Elias realized he was far from safety, not just physically, but mentally as well. He took a shuddering breath and sat upright. The medic finished bandaging his hands and offered him a dry set of mittens. His numb fingers slid into the wool liners like fragile instruments finding comfort. He flexed them experimentally, mindful of frostbite's threat. A second medic checked his vitals, pulse, breathing temperature, and murmured about mild hypothermia and early-stage frostbite. "You're going to need a trip to the field hospital," she said, "but for now, rest." Elias nodded, looking around. The others had already settled at a long table laden with hot tea and bread. He scooted his chair closer, hands shaking as he reached for a loaf that had been sliced that morning. He broke off a piece and bit down. The crust crackled, and crumbs fell like tiny moons onto the table. The taste of baked wheat and butter chased through his system, and he felt perhaps for the first time in hours like himself. Outside the tent flap, the mountain's roar continued, but inside voices low and comforting wove a tapestry of human connection. One of the climbers leaned toward him. "How did you keep yourself going?" she asked, genuine curiosity in her gaze. Elias paused, swirling his tea. "I thought about my daughter," he said softly. Her laugh, her smile. I had to see her again. Her eyes glistened with empathy. "She's lucky to have you," he swallowed. "She's my world." A silence fell, a comfortable hush. Then the head guide rose and addressed them all. "Let's get Elias stabilized, then we'll move him to base camp medical. We've got to get ahead of the frostbite." The team bustled into action once more. A stretcher was prepared, warm blankets piled atop it. Elias allowed them to slide him gently onto the soft surface. The movement chipped at his remaining strength, but he simply closed his eyes and let himself be carried. As the stretcher bearers lifted him, his gaze drifted to the tent's far corner where a small lantern hung. Its flame danced in the dim light, flickering like hope reborn. Guides formed a protective line around the stretcher, their boots crunching in unison as they carried him out of the mess tent. Elias peered upward, taking in the cavernous snowdrifts beyond the entrance. Snowflakes drifted like embers, illuminated by the lantern's glow. He inhaled one last breath of tent-warmed air, then exhaled as he crossed into the night's embrace. Outside, two guides shouldered the stretcher, navigating the snow toward the medical cabin. The wind tugged at the blankets, but the blankets held him in a cocoon. Elias's thoughts drifted between pain and gratitude. Gratitude that the Avalanche's fury had spared him, that rescuers had heard his taps, that he would soon see his daughter's face again. The cabin's lights gleamed through frosted windows as they arrived. He heard the lock release, felt the floor beneath him change from snow to wood planks, and sensed movement as medics ushered him inside. Warm air surged, scented with antiseptic and medicine. They slid the stretcher onto a cot, and he felt the blankets lift as they checked his injuries. Elias lay back, every fiber of his being tensed, then slowly unwound as warmth suffused him. Voices overlapped questions about his condition, reassurances about care, but he let them wash over him like a soft wave. He stared at the ceiling's wooden beams, mind drifting to Mara's bedtime story, her sleepy head resting against his chest. He knew that she would be waiting up for him, that her mother would have kept her awake with tales of her brave father. A medic wrapped his arm in a warming device. Another placed a heated mask over his face, breathing steam into his nose and mouth. For a moment, pain receded entirely as warmth embraced him. The last sensation he registered was the steady hum of life support equipment, a soft lullaby after the glacier's roar. Elias awoke to the gentle crackle of wood in the stove, the low murmur of voices drifting through the medical cabin. Pale dawn light filtered through frost-lined windows, casting soft shafts across the blankets that cocooned him. He lay still for a moment, listening not to the mountain's roar, but to the steady rhythm of human life. Footsteps on wooden floors, the hiss of steam from a kettle, quiet laughter as a nurse exchanged pleasantries with the cabin's cook. In that gentle chorus, he recognized his true rescue community. He pushed aside the blankets and swung his legs over the side of the cot. Dizziness washed over him, but he gripped the mattress edge and inhaled deeply, tasting the sweetness of brewed tea carried on the air. A nurse appeared with a mug, pressing it into his hands. The warmth seeped through the mug's ceramic into his palms, and he closed his eyes, centering himself on that small comfort. One sip, then another, and he felt the slow return of strength. Soft steps approached, and the head guide stood by his side, eyes often glancing at his bandaged hands and stiff shoulders. "You're doing well," the guide said quietly. "We'll have you on your feet soon." Elias nodded, then gestured toward the cabin's wood-burning stove. "It's peaceful," he managed. "Unlike the mountain." The guide smiled gently. "A different kind of power," he said. "Here, the fire bends to us." Elias considered that the mountain's violence and the cabin's warmth, two forces of nature interacting with humanity in opposing ways. He sipped the tea again, watching the tendrils of steam curl upward and dissolve. In that small dance, he saw the contrast between chaos and calm. When he felt steady, he rose, leaning on the guide's supportive arm. His legs wobbled, but each step onto the wooden floor grounded him more. At the cabin's hearth, logs glowed orange, drawing him forward. He settled into a nearby chair, allowing the warmth to seep into his bones. Outside, snow drifted against the panes, a silent testament to the mountain's ongoing presence. Inside, he was safe. Cradling the mug, Elias reflected on what he'd endured: the avalanche's thunder, the black ice cavern, the desperate tapping of his axe, the solitary struggle for every breath. Memories swirled in his mind like the storm beyond the window. He recalled Mara's laughter, her bright confidence, and understood, at a visceral level, why his love for her had eclipsed every fear. It had been that love, more than skill or gear, that pulled him through. A quiet knock sounded at the door, and the cabin's cook entered, offering a plate of porridge studded with fruit. "For strength," she said softly. Elias nodded in thanks and accepted a spoonful. The gentle sweetness of oats and berries reminded him that life could still be simple, nourishing, and kind after the mountain's barbarity. Every bite felt like a small triumph. He placed the spoon aside and stared into the fire's heart, watching the logs crack and shift. Flames danced, casting elaborate shadows that flickered across the cabin's walls. In that dance, he perceived a mirror of his journey, collapse and renewal darkness, and light the shifting patterns of ice and the constant warmth of hearth. He realized that survival was more than enduring. It was emerging transformed. Elias reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the small ice crystal talisman he'd carried from the glacier's depths. It lay cool in his hand, its facets catching the firelight. He turned it slowly, appreciating how its form reflected both fragility and resilience. He placed it on the table beside him, a tangible echo of his ordeal, and a reminder of nature's dual character. Beyond the cabin, a guide called to start the day's chores, collecting medical supplies, checking satellite comms, preparing for the journey down the valley. Those tasks would soon claim Elias too, but in that moment, he lingered, drinking deep of warmth and reflection. The mountain's power remained immutable and awe-inspiring, yet tempered by humanity's capacity to shelter, heal, and care. He raised his mug in silent salute to the fire, to the cabin's humble guardians, and to Mara waiting miles away. The cabin's windows framed a world of white, but here inside color thrived the hearth's ember red, the spoon's polished silver, the crystal's prism. Elias inhaled the cabin's air one last time, imprinting its calm upon his bones. In his mind, he spoke to the mountain, offering gratitude for its lessons and respect for its might. He vowed to carry that respect into every future step on peaks, in valleys, and in the quiet hearths that would welcome him home. Then he rose, finished his porridge, and prepared to leave the cabin's sanctuary, stepping forward into a life remade by firelight and love. Now enjoy this gentle closing as we let the embers of the tale settle. Slowly now imagine embers glowing softly in a hearth. Let every crackle and sigh of flame ease your heartbeat. Feel the warmth trailing down your arms, each glow sweeping away the mountain's chill and leaving only calm behind. Breathe in slowly, the steady scent of wood smoke and safe shelter filling your lungs. Breathe out, gently releasing tension like drifting sparks ascending into the night. The ordeal has passed, the storm's roar now a distant memory. Picture the fire's glow softening its light, folding into shadows that hush the cabin's corners. In that hush, find the quiet pulse of life, unbroken the hearth's steady heat, the rising steam from a fragrant cup, the gentle murmur of companions nearby. Rest in that pulse, steady, sure, and unthreatened. Let your mind drift out through the cabin's windows to the silent snowscape beyond, where stars gleam against a velvet sky. Each star a reminder that even in vast stillness, light endures. Imagine yourself embraced by that stillness, cradled in warmth, unhurried and whole. Now soften your thoughts. Let the embers fade to gentle warmth and rest in the soft whisper of peace.